All right, so today is a very exciting topic because we are going into simulation theory. Now, I stated that one of the primary focuses of this channel is to go over matrices, systems, and dynamics. Now, those, especially matrices and systems, are essentially the material realities of a system which is going to simulate various simulacra, to put it in very Beaudrillard terms. So what does this mean? We have systems, so these systems uphold society, and each of these systems offers various types of like programs or whatever they may have, and those affect the population. All right, so that's a simulation right there. So if we were to have the education system say, we have noticed our literacy success rates are at an all-time low, we are going to implement a literacy success program. So we are going to determine we need 100 staff members. We want to reach out to 1,000 students. We are going to use this curriculum. We're going to meet 3 times a week, and we're going to discuss these things. And by the end of it, we're going to have these type of measurable achievements that we can say over time there was an effect or a result. So that, again, that's a simulation of the program, of the matrix, of a system to affect some sort of change or maintenance over the population. So on the very sort of base level, going into what is simulation theory in terms of matrices, systems, and dynamics. Now, because we are talking about simulation theory, after we first establish what is a simulation in terms of the matrix and systems and dynamics, we are also going to get into how is simulation theory also connected to the body, to the individual itself, so that we're not just talking about simulation theory in terms of this overarching hegemonic structure, but we're also talking about the individual who is inside of that structure as well, to analyze the tree in the forest and the forest comprised of trees. So first, let's go ahead and get into simulation theory. So, and especially how it relates to matrices and systems, or anything that is hegemonic. So whenever we get into systems and matrices, especially in connection to simulation theory, you're gonna have to read Beaudrillard. And Beaudrillard basically says that nothing is real, and everything is a simulation, or everything is basically a copy or an imitation. And he even goes further to say that the imitation eventually becomes that which is preferable to the real. We're so obsessed with creating artifact that we take what's real, we break it down, and we reassemble something to our likeness, we repackage it, and then that becomes what becomes the ideal or the simulacra. So an example of structural type of matrices related simulation would be a zoo is an example of a simulation. Any type of enclosure for an animal is a simulation, because every animal needs its own particular habitat. It needs its own like temperature, its own feeding schedule. Whatever it eats also needs to be specific to its simulation. If you are growing plants indoors, it's often recommended that you simulate that plant's nature or natural environment in order to facilitate its proper growth. So a simulation is also an artificial type of environment, something that is artificially constructed. So again, an aquarium, that's a simulation of a matrix, and a matrices of a simulation, because you are taking fish out of, let's say, the Great Barrier Reef, and you're putting them in New York City. And so that requires you to create this whole simulation, this whole system, which simulates that of Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. Now, on that note, Beaudrillard basically says that society is structured in terms of a simulation like a zoo, that everything that goes on in the zoo, because he goes on even further than that to say that the zoo actually is essentially predicates society itself. That how we see the zoo simulating the animals is exactly how we should see the way certain matrices or systems create any sort of simulation around us. So, for example, a hospital is full of simulation. So even if you think of a surgery is a simulation because it's essentially predetermined. It's also a simulation because it's not the first surgery that's ever happened. So in the same process and procession of Simulacra, where you had the person who did the first surgery, but obviously it was crafted and perfected over time, right? And so now we have a simulation of an ancient medical practice. It's not the first one, but we simulate it because it's effective. Now, Beaudrillard would take that further to say, all right, if you were to take like Dr. Dre, like he's not a technically a doctor, but what he is enacting is a simulation of the doctor. You see, and everything that would symbolize with it. So that's another extension of a type of like simulation. But the point is that the zoo, in the exact ways that assimilates the environment, the habitat is how we should really think about the matrix and the system which encompasses and creates our society. So in this, we also see a really real existential question about freedom or free will, because once we notice that, yes, we might have an enclosure of any kind of animal and they may have free range, but do they really have free will? You see, and so this is another conundrum of the simulation itself. It's a very illusory type of thing. There is no truth. There is no actual material reality. He's even saying not the only thing that's really real is the map itself. But even then, everything is changing. And in that way, we could, I think a prime example is here in New York City. We might have the map of New York City, but we know that storefronts change all the time. And so them being there in a way is kind of illusory because they're there for that time. But once that time is up, something else is going to substitute it. And then there's something else in that place. So there is essentially nothing real. And he goes on to call this the desert of the real, that there is no real thing left anymore. Everything is essentially a simulation of something else. So even on that note, a simulation of a simulacra could be like, if we were to begin with Marilyn Monroe, she is an icon for a specific image, and we see her image simulated in different generations. So I would say Madonna is a simulation of Marilyn Monroe, for example. And Gwen Stefani is an extension of Madonna and also Marilyn Monroe. So we see a simulation of very similar aesthetic type of icon. And I would even further go to say, when Kim Kardashian is really trying to be in that lineage, which she's not, that's another extension of when Simulacra is really trying to replicate and copy something in order to create something of itself. I would just argue that Kim Kardashian at her roots does not have anything of like that lineage in her. But what we can see is the attempt to co-opt the real by the fake. And that's a very real struggle that Beaudrillard observes in this world. He's saying there's a lot of real, there's not a lot of real. It's very rare to be actually real. But what's very common and everywhere is that everybody's trying to simulate something else. So even if you were to take YouTube videos where they'll take a reaction video, you're not even looking at the music video itself, you're looking at a reaction to that. So it's a type of simulacra of the original video. And if we're talking about originals, we would have to think, well, who came out with original reaction videos, or what were the closest thing to reaction videos that we had? Another example is that we could think of the classroom as a simulation, because it all comes from lesson plannings. We know that there's going to be a lesson plan, and by that lesson plan, it has to simulate that plan in real time in the classroom itself. And it also has to include the behaviors. So by behaviors, the behaviors have to conform to that simulation of the lesson plan. We can also say it's a simulation historically, because every classroom is essentially just a simulation of like ancient academic academies. So like the academies of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle are essentially the original real. And every school after that is basically just a simulation of that school. It's not the original Plato or Socrates schools. Every school is just basically also just historically a simulation of the original academies. But also materially and spatially, because this simulation also is going to have, the books, the textbooks, the markers, the journals, the pens, everything materially to create that material simulation. So it's not going to be enough to have somebody in a room saying, we're going to learn this. You need to have the actual construction of it to mirror that simulation. So that's how and why a classroom itself can also be a simulation, right? And some other things that Beaudrillard was really trying to get at the root, which he was saying are illusory, was urbanization. So if we take the basic look at nature and the world as it is, and we contrast that to urban cityscapes, we obviously see that in terms of the sidewalk, concrete has replaced the grass. And that's normal. And so that's artificial because the real world has grass, right? But the simulacra, the fake, is the actual sidewalk. And what Beaudrillard is saying, we get so accustomed to the fake that we veer away when we see the real. So for anybody who's in New York City, born and raised, I'm from Texas, so I'm just speaking of people that I know from here, who I've known from here, have a very strong aversion to the idea of camping because it's outside. Now, Beaudrillard would say that, the concrete jungle has replaced the real. And so as a human, there's a type of discomfort when in the actual natural setting, because that simulation, that matrices, is so real. The sidewalk being, and the concrete itself being a substitution for the grass or for the dirt. It's a type of material simulation that is so in our face. But we also get reiterations of the simulation in that none of us are really free from taxes. You see, so there's an invisible law that is re-edifying that we are in a system. Nobody can just go and burn cars. That's in my mind because somebody in the Bronx just did that. We can't just do that because there's a system that is going to reinforce that you can't do that. So even if you don't have this physical like wall to represent we are in the simulation, we also do have certain rules, whether legal or social, that reinforce that we are in this particular type of system. So even in terms of urbanization, he's just saying those from the city just kind of recognize the earth was here first, and that's the real. So if you think about those like indigenous tribes that have never made contact with the first world, you're gonna see what you're really seeing is the difference of two different types of people who came from two different matrices. So and two very concepts of what's real also, because even on a cultural level, how we operate might be very different from them, and some of their rules might be so wild to us that we would say that can't exist here. Like we don't do that here, or something like that. Now he also is saying in the ways that simulation is very illusory is through language itself, and that gets to representation theory and even like number symbology theory. So if you think about any kind of numbers that we have, they're just symbolic for something that actually exists. So we can't ever really get right into the actual thing that we're studying. So for example, we can have any kind of metric surrounding the sun, and we can understand it's however many Kelvin it is, but we will never touch the sun, and we will never be the sun. We will never occupy a particular consciousness where we could actually cross that threshold. We can gather data about it. We can possibly put certain data into a type of like computer simulation to say what would happen if we dump gasoline in the sun, whatever the case is, but we're never gonna get beyond the representation of the real either. So we're very limited in that type of way. Again, in terms of numbers, they're like, we could say 100 degrees, but we're really talking about energy at that point. So 100 degrees is just our way of putting a measure on something that dimensionally doesn't even exist in our dimensionality besides observing it. So in several ways, we're not just implicated in a type of system of matrices, but we're also on a psychological level reinforce the values of that matrices or that system, and that does influence our behaviors. We do things subconsciously because of these rules. For example, stopping at a red light or going at a green light, perhaps at first, if somebody was first coming here, they would have to learn it. But somebody who is maybe born and raised here, that's just kind of a very subconscious thing that we don't put in check, because that's just one of the social rules that acts as a social pillar that nobody really breaks. So again, that's that. So a quote from Beaudrillard, and this goes into the fact that we are, as individuals, living in a matrix, and this matrix creates certain programs that affect the individual. So for example, when George Bush Jr. came out with No Child Left Behind, that was a simulation for the students of Texas to ensure that every student did well, theoretically, although it failed. A stop and frisk in New York City, that's a simulation. Stop and frisk is a simulation to reduce crime, even though it was also failed. But it's still a simulation in that it was created out of the system. The governmental body created the stop and frisk system to be imposed on the population. The governmental system also created No Child Left Behind to impose itself onto the population itself. So a simulation of again, is a creation of the matrices or the system itself. It's the program. So, going into Beaudrillard, he's saying capital was never linked by a contract to society that it dominated. So again, I'm saying the matrix creates programs or simulations that affect the population. The Texas governmental system created the No Child Left Behind, which was imposed on the population. Now, this is saying capital was never linked by contract to society that it dominates. But what we can see here is that capital does have a type of hierarchy over that society, and it has a type of resources that can and does dominate over that society. Same thing, stop and frisk. Capital was never linked by a contract to society that it dominates. The New York City government created stop and frisk to dominate over society in that particular way, but that capital was never actually linked by contract to that society. You see, so it's a simulation by it. A third one is going to be whenever we have before the migrant crisis, New York City was running, let's say just theoretically, on in its own simulation, right? But then you had this wave of migrants, and what that did was it over simulated the matrices, that system. So we can think of if the migrant wave was one closed system, it was an addition of over simulation to a system that was already simulated within New York City. And we saw that pervasive throughout all the systems within New York City. It impacted healthcare, the homeless shelters, the food stamps, the education system. All of these different systems were over simulated by the presence of a +1 system in the form of the migrant system. Because it takes something to simulate it, to stimulate it, right? And you need money to stimulate it specifically. So again, those are the ways that the matrices itself is this hegemonic reality. Whether it has this very real material object, capital reality to it, so a governmental building, very capital realistic. We could say that's probably more permanent in Beaudrillard's map of the real, desert of the real, where the map is always changing. You know, we could probably count on a moms and pops place to change over time, but that governmental one is going to be staying there. A university is also probably closer to a more permanent material capital in this map, which is always changing in this desert of the real. So I think that pretty much sums it up in terms of what is simulation, and the fact that a simulation is born out of the matrix. It's something to impose over the population itself. And even if we take a look at the stimulations that happened during COVID, I think it's just very clear you needed that financial stimulation to have the simulation in that societal system or matrices. That our normal capitalistic functionality was not moving forward because people hadn't made money. And the government was at a point where it needed to stimulate what was under-simulated. It was normatively operating under the simulation of consumer buyers, but because of COVID, it decreased the workers, which affected the buyers, the consumers and the sellers. And so it needed to inject a type of stimulation, that economic stimulation, because the workforce itself had been under-simulated. So again, an example of the capital itself creating some sort of program over the people to enact them to behave in a way that just reinforces the capital itself too. All right, now looking over my notes, I'm just checking for any other type of last minute things in case I was missing out, but that is everything. So that is essentially the simulation aspect of systems and matrices in a nutshell. Now I'm going to be moving on to simulation theory as it intersects with both quantum theory and also just human existentialism. All right, thank you. All right, so this is the second component of simulation theory, where we are going to intersect simulation theory with the body. And this is also going to go into holographic theory and also into quantum mechanics at an intersection of biophysics. So getting right into it, I guess I'll just first off list the various citations I'll be using. So the very, well, actually not in any particular order, but I will be using a part of Walter Russell's The Secret of Lights. I'll be using and citing actually the Psyche as electromagnetic interaction, patterns of conscious energy by Minya Long. I'll also be citing actually the Hermetica by Hermes Trismegistus. And I'll also be mentioning various names and theories within quantum mechanics in an effort to combine and bridge all of these together. So where to begin? If we were to think about, let's actually just begin with basic quantum mechanics, and then we're actually going to move into biophysics, and it's not as big as it sounds. Going into quantum mechanics, if we were to think of Schrodinger's cat, the uncertainty principle, Pauli's exclusion principle, quantum entanglement, all of these are theories and posits which are essentially saying that we don't really observe our universe as we see it. The universe is more dualistic than we actually realize. And even if we're thinking in terms of supersymmetry or the double slit experiment, we as in scientists have observed that particles essentially their behaviors lead to a question as to whether or not these particles themselves are even conscious, right? And so there's then a difference between even the type of control that we have over our universe. So I think at the root of it is a psychological existential type of quandary. But really what it's suggesting is the intelligence and the organization and the particular dynamics surrounding quantum mechanics are a particular type of organization or consciousness which we do observe, but we have no control over. And that's what I'm saying. There's this existential psychological question, because then the question becomes who or what is that intelligence? Or is the universe or the universe itself intelligent, or are even particles at the quantum length, the Planck length, also intelligent? And with the double slit experiment, we do see that particles will choose the less predictable thing. With the observation effect, we see that particles will behave differently once they are observed, right? So that even suggests the types of receptivity. But my point is that the very fundamental building blocks of our universe they might comprise a larger cosmological type of structures, but they themselves are also fairly unpredictable, although they also follow very specific types of laws of physics that we know it. So to first establish the universe as we know it on the outside, but also that they're unpredictable, right? But also, and this is moving into biophysics, we are comprised of these subatomic atoms and molecules. So let's even stop to think about that. If I were to take a look at my hand or whatever, it's obviously solid. But I know if I were to take a little piece of my skin and put it under like even an electronic microscope, I'm going to see it's comprised of all these molecules. And they're not stagnant. They're not static. They're in motion. They are constantly in motion. They are even exchanging energies, shifting from different energetic states, using that type of biophysics to, on a quantum level, exchange like sodium or potassium to create a type of electrical confluence to bring about like diffusion, for example, in like a semi-permeable membrane, for example. But the real point here is that we as bodies have a type of duality to us already that we don't necessarily awaken ourselves to. And it's that, yes, we look at our body and it appears solid, but it is actually comprised of these subatomic particles. So within us is already the quantum. It's already the Planck length, right? So that has to be first stated, that we are essentially on a very simplistic terms, a compilation of neutrons, electrons, and protons. Just very simply, but we are also blind to it in a lot of ways. And that consciousness, or that lack of consciousness about it, is really critical for simulation theory also. And we're going to get into that. Now, that's just laying the principles of like quantum mechanics and how it poses a real type of existential quandary for us as material beings who are alive in our, I would actually argue that we are in a fifth dimensional world and not a third dimensional world. All right, so now moving into the biophysics of it. If we even think of DNA, within us is also not just a specific code which could express itself phenotypically, but that which it does. So we have to realize the hair that I see is actually just a simulation of a genetic code. The skin I have is just a phenotypical simulation of a genetic code. You see, so there's almost no real difference between my hair or your hair except for that genetic code. But the thing is that genetic code is at its reality on an invisible scale, on a molecular Planck length scale. But because of the dimensionality that we occupy, we do see the hair. We see any other differences there. We see the phenotypes of it, but we don't see the genotype. And in the same way, we see our fifth dimensional world, but we do not see the Planck length. We don't see the quantum world. All right, and that's important because that means our body is consistently simulating genotypical information and data, and it's expressing itself outward into the phenotypes. So when we see the phenotypes, we're not recognizing the root of the reality. That's just the product of the real reality, but it's not actually it. In the same way where if we're looking at a flower or a plant, the root of it is actually in the seed, which is hidden and invisible. So we could say any type of phenotypical thing, but that would just be the flower. And the genotypical thing would be the seed itself, which is invisible to us. That would be our DNA. So our bodies physically are already a simulation itself. We don't see it really, but it is. And you could probably take a biopsy of maybe a cancer patient's cells and add on radiation, and then on a cellular level, you would see those differences. So there's something which happens on a fundamental level, at a quantum level, which is the thing which is defining our physical material reality. All right. And we also know that there's just that progression going from cellular biology to a tissue, and then from the tissue to the organ, from the organ to the organ system, and then to the body system itself. So there is already an understanding that on a molecular level, it's connected to larger body systems and therefore the body itself. But that we don't see that. We're blind to that veil as we know it from our dimensionality. So again, the second point going into biophysics, our bodies are comprised of these particles which do have their own consciousness, and they, on a genotypical level, determine the phenotype. But again, the baseline is that genotype is on the Planck length and therefore not what we see. But it's the basis for creating that which is simulated and seen in our dimension. All right, so going again, how is the body itself a simulation? Whenever, let's say you drink a lot and your body's, your liver's feeling really damaged, so you, I don't know, drank a bunch of like good tea or whatever and had a bunch of medicine, you're simulating the type of environments that your liver needs to recuperate for itself on a cellular level. You see, so again, it's all a simulation on an atomic level that we see on a level of organ systems or body systems. But our bodies themselves are simulating various processes. Whenever the kidney filters out the blood, that's a simulation also. So the body itself is a simulation. Whenever you breathe in or out, that's a simulation of respiration. You see, so everything is simulation in the body. Everything is moving whether or not we're conscious to it. The way that a red blood cell will relinquish its oxygen to a non-oxygenated blood cell, that's a simulation. That is simulating an action which is keeping your body in motion, but you don't see it, but we know it happens, right? So that's on an atomic level. Now actually we're going to keep going into the biophysics part of it, but this is where we're going to get into actually Psyche as electromagnetic interaction, patterns of conscious energy by Minya Long. So basically what Minya Long is saying is our thoughts are basically electromagnetic patterns. And as electromagnetic patterns, we are influenced by other type of electromagnetic frequencies. Now, here I want to actually give this example of, there was a time, I want to say in the 1950s, where actually it was like during the Cold War, where there was like a US embassy in Russia, and what the Russians did is they began experimenting in electromagnetic frequencies, and they would emit these frequencies towards the US embassy, and eventually the people working there began getting headaches, began getting sick, feeling nauseous and things like that. And then they found that these electromagnetic frequencies were somehow affecting not just the mind in terms of like the psychological framework of the brain, but also the brain itself anatomically as the anatomical structure of the human itself. So in this, we do see the very real effects of electromagnetic patterns on the brain. We also just see this with music. The electromagnetic frequencies of a song can actually like uplift somebody's emotions or bring them down, depending on that the frequencies in that song itself. So again, Minya Long is saying that the psyche, or the collection of our thoughts and who we are, is all electromagnetic. And to point out, psyche means soul. So our soul, our personality, who we are. Minya Long is saying that that's an electromagnetic vibration, basically. She's specifying we don't just have a specific vibe, but she's saying that vibe is specifically electromagnetic, right? And Minya Long would act, even though she wrote this book in like the 1960s or 80s or something like that, she would definitely agree with our modern slang of vibe and somebody's vibe. She would say that's a very real reality, because everybody does have a vibe. That vibe has its own frequency, its own signature, and it's something that everybody else can perceive. Now, this is where it might get into a little bit more of a rabbit hole for some, because Minya Long, a part of her research is, I would say it's connected with theoastrology. So ancient theoastrology. So let's talk a little bit about ancient theoastrology. So, astrotheology. Ancient astrotheology basically saying, is basically the truth that the ancient world religion was astrology. You know, if we were to look at the ancient Aztecs, the ancient Egyptians, any other major world religion or belief system, even like with the ancient Chinese, with the ancient Chinese zodiac, each of these cultures and all ancient cultures had this belief in astrology, that the planets themselves emitted a type of frequency, and that frequency influenced you. Right, so whenever they said that Venus was out there, Venus being a goddess of love, they were really saying that planet itself provides a type of specific energy that we can call as love. And they really believed, more so on a literal level, that whenever you were like finding love, you were literally in the vibration of Venus, because that's the particular vibration that Venus gives off. Right, and they would say also, like, if you were to feel like you're in love, that's because your psyche, your soul, is being influenced by that electromagnetic frequency or vibe coming from Venus, right? And so astrotheology, the ancient belief in astrology as a global belief system is essentially actually backing up Minya Long, because Minya Long is she did various studies on electromagnetic patterns in the brain, and she also coincided them with the movement of the universe. And she noticed that there were various frequencies within our brains which would either increase or decrease according to planet positionalities, which that was just the strict scientific observation of that. But I think it pretty much just goes and overlaps with astrotheology pretty perfectly, actually. So Minya Long is basically saying the planets with their own natural frequency, and we know that every planet does have its own frequency, is connected to the human psyche, and we can see behavioral patterns that mirror this, but we could also see individually within the person themselves various frequencies being transmitted or received or affected by other types of frequencies that are on a planetary level. So what this is suggesting is, especially with the backdrop of astrotheology, is that the planets do affect our behaviors, right? So now this is actually going to lead into the Hermetica by Hermes Trismegistus, because first of all, Hermes Trismegistus said yes, that the world and men were created with free will, but they were going to be controlled and dictated by the planets. That the planets themselves would be the thing to limit man. And I think that is also a good fit for Minya Long, saying that the planets provide a particular frequency which affect the electromagnetic sphere of our psyche. But it also corroborates with the astrotheological perspective that the planets do affect us on a psychological level as well, even if that's a more spiritual framework. And again, in the Hermetica, Hermes Trismegistus is saying that man will be free, but the planets themselves will be the things that dictate a man, that they will create currents by which he will have to move. So, again, if going into the Venus thing, a guy could have been doing his thing, but if that sort of like Venus energy came across him and he found love, the sort of even Hermetic principle behind that would be, well, that's because the planet created this frequency that you picked up on, and are you going to pick up on that love or not? So it goes into simulation theory, but also like free will, in the same way that I hate to say it, but in a zoo, you could have that enclosure and that simulation, but is that animal really going to have free will? You see, so in simulation, in respect to Psyche's interaction, and especially as in relation to the Hermetica, it's saying that we are, if you take the Hermetica as a valid source and not just this mythological thing, it's basically corroborating and saying you're going to be influenced by the planets. It's a simulation that you're going to receive. So, this also connects with actually Walter Russell, because Walter Russell says life is the pulsing electromagnetic oscillation of thinking mind. So in the same way that you have Minya Long saying that the psyche itself is an electromagnetic energy, Russell is saying life is a pulsing electromagnetic thinking mind. So in this we see a lot of dynamism. If it is electromagnetic, that means the mind is already in between electricity and magnetism. So in between that, the mind has to consolidate these two energies, which is already a simulation. That's not the free will. The free will would live outside of that, but it has to consider these various types of like frequencies or energies according to Walter Russell. Now, again, in the Hermetica, Hermes Trismegistus says all is atom, right? And he might spell it as ATUM, but because of like etymological similarities, I'm gonna take the liberty to say ATOM, atom. And I think that's actually a very profound thing for somebody to have said in ancient time, that all is atom, ATOM, because as we are approaching and are into like supercomputers and a higher technological stage of our own evolution, it has to be stated that the discovery of the atom, according to the modern world, was very new for the time. So for this guy to say all is atom is actually very profound for that time. But it also gets into simulation theory, right? Because if everything is an atom, especially like I could knock on wood and it's going to feel hard, but the reality is this is made out of atoms. It's made out of small subatomic things that I can't necessarily see with my visible light. You see, and so if everything is atom, so is my body. And if my body is an atom, it's just a simulation of deeper atomic realities, right? And also, if it's an atom, then so are my organs. So is everything actually in this material reality. So whenever Hermes Trismegistus is saying everything is atom, in a way he's also saying everything is just a simulation. Nothing is necessarily at the root of it itself. So that connects with those texts, but it also connects with Psyche as an electromagnetic frequency. Because if we are all made of atoms, and if everything is the atom and all is atom, and our psyche is electromagnetic, that would explain the electromagnetic frequencies, because atoms are electromagnetic. So everything is essentially connecting in the same ways that quantum mechanics would say that light is both a particle and a wave. It's like, on one hand, there are these forces which are observing light as a particle, and on the other hand, others are saying this is light as a wave, and at center is the light itself, right? Now, what the quote also suggests, and again, that's a part of Walter Russell's life principle by name: life is the pulsing electromagnetic oscillation of the thinking mind. What this also suggestion is that there is no mortal life. It's suggesting a continuation of consciousness, that the genetic data that is contained within us is going to be that unspoken continuation of consciousness. What is the real origins of my thoughts or ideas? So even if you have like a grandfather, and later on he has a grandson, and that grandson is exactly like him to a T, under this framework, it's suggesting that actually there has been no real like energetic change between them. That is the same energy. So even according to Walter Russell, energy doesn't necessarily die either. So that energy could reappear later on. Again, going into simulation itself. Now, one of the last two things that I want to point out is Walter Russell's laws of thermodynamics, and how does that intersect with the body itself as this type of material reality of biophysics. And it's going to get into the law of thermodynamics. So we know that in the law of thermodynamics, we're all decaying, right? We're all essentially on an atomic level decaying, which means that we're slowly dying, but we have no clue about it, because that decay is so slow, we just don't process it, right? Now, what Walter Russell says is that our decaying essentially matches the speed of light, so that it gives the continuation of an illusion of a continuation, when in reality, on an atomic level, that energy is atrophying. But we have these two different rates: the rate at which these atoms decay, but there's also the speed of light at which we perceive material reality. And because our perception of light is faster, we do not process the decaying. The decaying is too slow for us to actually just physically be able to process. So here we have another schism between our consciousness and the actual baseline reality of what is simulating our actuality, or creating our materiality even. So the direct quote from this is that the speed of light, going at such a high rate of speed that carbon with equal radioactive outer speed explodes in such a limited curved space field that the motion can reproduce itself within the curvature of space. So again, especially when you have carbon at center of it, carbon is the atom which builds us. And so what he's saying is carbon itself has its own frequency. It has its own speed. So whenever he's saying specifically here for like the seed of life, it has this equal radioactive outer explosive speed, and it breaks the limit of a curved space field in which motion can reproduce itself in the curvature of space. So this is the crux of biophysics. This is where we see carbon as a seed interacting as this, not just like thermodynamic like element, but a literal seed of life, a biophysical seed of life that interacts with space, time, and light itself to create life from carbon. You see, and that rate has to be obviously much more higher than our rate of decay. But we don't see these two interplaying energies. The light, which is the energy which is constantly renewing our bodies, but there's also an atrophying which constantly atrophies our bodies, but we don't see that because our vision is at this light speed. We're acclimated to the speed of light, and these other rates of decay or creation exist outside of that, outside of our consciousness of it, but those are the baseline realities of what we see. Now, there's also is saying that matter and light are essentially the same thing. So Walter Russell says light is the basis for all matter. We saw that with Einstein. He was saying E equals mc squared. So if I got this little bit of matter and I sped it up to the speed of light, I could get energy, and vice versa. But for Walter Russell, he's saying light is the basis for material reality, and from that comes all other material realities. That's holographic then. So if the basis, because that's like saying water is the basis for all drinks, and you could have a 7-Up or you could have a Kool-Aid, but that's just a hologram. That's not the baseline reality. The baseline reality is the water, and not just the water, but the atoms of the water itself. And in the same way, Walter Russell is saying that we have light is the basis of our reality, and out of light comes materiality. So again, I could say that's a laptop or that's a desk, but according to Walter Russell, these are actually all based out of light because they are all atomic in nature. They just particularly happen to have a particular type of like density or frequency to exist within our dimensionality. But, you know, if you were to say in 1,000 years, if you were to chunk this laptop into a black hole, it would be broken down into its most elementary particles and then dispersed. And then at that point, we would see the atomic reality of this laptop. And so, again, this kind of interplay between the quantum reality and the type of dimensionality that we occupy as according to our own consciousness, which is limited. So we don't even pick up on UV rays or infrared or even microwaves like visually, and so we are actually very critically out of tune with very fundamental principles and bases that comprise our universe. So even on the note of like simulation, according to Walter Russell, he says that we have a confusion between luminosity versus light. He says that light is just there. So let's say you were in the back of a room and the sunlight were to come in and you could see the light traveling through the room. He's saying what you're seeing is actually luminosity. It's not light. he's basically saying light as atoms stand still in their own space-time. And we think that light is coming in, but actually the energy of the photon is just going and bouncing from light to light to light particle until it reaches us. So it's just an emission of that radiation, but the particles of light are always there, in the same way where if we were in the ocean and someone were to release some ink, we know that it's not that the water it's not that the ink itself is really transporting itself to us. It's that we're already surrounded by water particles, and the chemical of that ink is bouncing from one water particle to the other until it reaches us. So what Walter Russell is basically saying is, what's water to the aquarium is light for our materiality. And so whenever we see light coming through a window, again, it's not that the light itself is moving, but it's the luminosity that's moving. The energy is transporting and bouncing from light particles which are already there but empty. And once they get that luminosity, that energy, they become excited, they become full, but then they relinquish it to the next particle. So it's not like one light particle actually moving through space. It's that energy is bouncing from one light particle to the other, because we're just all surrounded by light. So again, speaking of like simulation, Walter Russell is even saying the way we have processed information is just so deftly misoriented from how on a very quantum level the universe is created. All right, now looking over my notes, again, maybe there's some last minute thing. So here are my notes. I have, because we were talking about biophysics and how is it that we cannot observe the quantum reality, even if our bodies are decomposing and also creating within ourselves. In the same way, we know that water and light will be broken down and used on a chemical level for a plant to make its food and its leaves. We don't see that chemical reality, but we know that it's there, right? In the same way that Minya Long is saying our psyche takes in certain energies or vibrations, and from there it helps us grow or not as people. So again, going into that, but it also is showing a type of thermodynamic interaction within the framework of quantum mechanics and biophysics and biology, because light, energy, matter, and time are all in exchange for that plant. Everything is actually happening on the atomic level. Everything that actually matters, again, is about the nutrients that are going into that. Not necessarily the leaf or the flower or the branch, but the electronic transport system that's happening with the nutrients on that particular level. All right. Now, I think that is a pretty good way to end it. That was pretty hefty, but that's how simulation theory basically intersects with biophysics. Not only are our bodies materially comprised of atoms which exist at a subatomic Planck length, although we can obviously observe it from our own fifth dimensionality, there are some scholars that say even our psyches themselves are just simulation of other energies out there. So I thought to present that along with the question of what is a simulation in terms of the matrix. Because if our own thoughts inherently are just the after effect of an electromagnetic wave, then we become that much more far removed when the Matrix is saying, eat more of this, do less of that, etc. Right? So the system itself will also present its own social constructs of whatever it values. Right? The matrix of the system automatically posits that the sidewalk concrete is real and that the nature is the questionable thing. It's not just so wrapped up in its artifice, it can only exist and live in that artifice. Right? So the last thing that, if we're going to be speaking of simulation theory, Beaudrillard basically says it's all just a simulation and nothing is real. So, at the end of this, just to point out, we talked about simulation theory as it relates to systems and matrices, but we saw how simulations are essentially the product of a system. But we also see that a simulation is essentially the creation of something fake from the real to be taken as the real deal. Then we also saw simulation, how it relates to quantum mechanics, but also biophysics, that our bodies are just simulations of atoms. And we also connected the simulation theory to Psyche as electromagnetic frequencies or conscious energies, that even our psyches, according to certain theorists, will say that our thoughts are not even our own, but are rather the end result of being influenced by other electromagnetic frequencies. So that also connects to Walter Russell's life principle, and I think that's the best way to end on it, that life is a pulsing electromagnetic oscillation of the thinking mind. All right. Now, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.